Gray clouds rolled over the small town of Pine Creek as people dressed in black made their way to Hillside Cemetery. The weather forecast had called for light rain in the afternoon, but nobody expected the dark storm clouds that now gathered overhead. Folks hurried along the gravel paths between old gravestones, clutching umbrellas and helping elderly relatives across the uneven ground. Edward Thompson's funeral was supposed to be a quiet affair. He wasn't a famous man or particularly wealthy, but he had touched many lives in Pine Creek during his 62 years. As the local electrician, he had been the person everyone called when something went wrong in their homes. He never turned anyone away, even when they couldn't pay right away. "We'll figure something out," he always said with a kind smile that made wrinkles appear around his eyes. His wife Annie stood near the freshly dug grave, her round face pale and her eyes red from days of crying. Their son Robert held her arm, looking like he was trying to be strong but failing. At 28, he hadn't expected to bury his father so soon. Nobody had. Edward had seemed perfectly healthy until he collapsed in his workshop 3 days ago. Heart attack, the doctors said, quick and unexpected. He was rewiring Mrs. Wilson's kitchen when it happened, Annie had told people when they called with condolences. Doing what he loved right until the end. She tried to find comfort in that thought as she watched the funeral home staff position the simple wooden coffin near the grave. About 50 people gathered around, neighbors and friends who had known Edward for decades. Mr. Jenkins from the hardware store was there. He and Edward had gone fishing every summer since they were teenagers. The Anderson family came too. Edward had taught their oldest boy everything he knew about electrical work. Even old Mrs. Peterson made it out despite her bad hip. Edward had installed special lighting in her house when her eyesight started to fail, and never charged her a penny. Pastor Bill stepped forward as everyone settled into place. He was a tall, thin man with a kind voice that carried across the cemetery despite the rising wind. "Friends and family, we gather today to say goodbye to our brother Edward Thompson," he began, holding his Bible tight as a gust of wind threatened to turn the pages. "A man who brought light to our homes and to our lives." Annie nodded slightly at the fitting words. That was Edward, always bringing light. Edward believed in helping others. He believed in community. He lived by the principle that we are put on this earth to make it better for those around us, Pastor Bill continued. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, causing a few people to glance nervously at the sky. The storm was moving closer. "Maybe we should speed things up a bit," someone whispered, but Pastor Bill carried on, sharing stories of Edward's generosity and kindness. In the third row, Edward's childhood friend Tom clutched his wife's hand. They had all grown up together in Pine Creek, played in the same creeks, gone to the same schools. It didn't seem possible that Edward was gone. Just last month they'd had dinner together, and Edward had been talking excitedly about plans to teach evening classes at the community center. "Everyone should know basic electrical safety," he'd said passionately over dessert. "It could save lives." The first fat raindrops began to fall as Pastor Bill invited Annie to speak. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she unfolded a piece of paper. "I met Edward when my car broke down outside his parents' house," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "It was pouring rain just like today. He came out with an umbrella and insisted on helping. That was Edward, always ready to help a stranger." More thunder rumbled closer now, but Annie continued, determined to share her memories of 40 years with the love of her life. She told about their wedding day, when the power went out at the reception hall and Edward fixed it in his tuxedo. She spoke of how he taught Robert to ride a bike, patiently running alongside until the boy found his balance. She mentioned the Christmas when Edward secretly installed beautiful lights all around their house while she was visiting her sister, creating a magical homecoming for her. "He lit up my world," she finished simply, folding the paper and returning to her son's side. By now the rain was falling steadily and people opened umbrellas or pulled up coat collars. Nobody wanted to leave, though. Not until they'd properly said goodbye to Edward. Pastor Bill invited people to share their own memories, and despite the worsening weather, several stepped forward. Mr. Jenkins told about the time Edward saved, A fishing trip by fixing their boat motor with just a pocket knife and some fishing line. The local school principal remembered how Edward had volunteered countless hours rewiring the old school building to make it safer for the children. Through the stories, a complete picture emerged, not of a perfect man, but of a good one. Someone who found joy in solving problems and helping others. Someone who taught younger people his skills without jealousy or competition. Someone who believed in fairness and second chances. The wind picked up as the last speaker finished, whipping through the cemetery and bending the flowers that had been placed around Edward's coffin. The storm was almost directly overhead now, the sky dark as evening, though it was only 2 in the afternoon. Perhaps we should move to the final prayers, Pastor Bill suggested, raising his voice over the wind. Edward wouldn't want anyone catching pneumonia on his account. A few people managed small smiles at that. It was true. Edward had always worried about others' comfort more than his own. As Pastor Bill began the closing prayer, asking for comfort, for the family and celebrating Edward's entrance into heaven, the air around them seemed to change. Later, people would describe it as a feeling of pressure or electricity. The hair on people's arms stood up. There was a metallic taste in the air. Robert noticed it first and looked up with alarm. "Mom, I think we should—" He never finished the sentence. A blinding flash of light struck from the clouds above, aimed as if by some cosmic hand directly at Edward's coffin. The sound was immediate and deafening, not the usual gap between lightning and thunder, but a simultaneous crack that seemed to split the world apart. Everyone jumped back. Several people screamed. Annie fell to her knees, her hands over her ears. For a moment, no one could see properly, just dancing spots where the lightning had been. When vision returned, they stared in shock at the scene before them. The wooden coffin was smoking slightly. The metal handles and decorative fixtures had literally melted. The flowers around it were scattered and singed. "Is everyone okay?" Pastor Bill called out, his own voice shaking as he helped an elderly woman back to her feet. "Is anyone hurt?" Miraculously, no one seemed injured. The lightning had struck with incredible precision, hitting only the coffin and leaving the mourners physically unharmed, though thoroughly shocked. The cemetery workers approached cautiously, checking for fire. One of them gasped and jumped back. "What is it?" Robert asked, rushing forward despite his mother's attempt to hold him back. The worker pointed, unable to speak. Through the damaged lid of the coffin came a sound that should have been impossible, a weak but unmistakable groan. People stood frozen, wondering if their ears were playing tricks on them after the thunder. But then it came again, slightly louder. "Call an ambulance," Robert shouted, already moving to pry open the damaged coffin. "Sawyer, hurry." Mr. Jenkins rushed to help him while someone else dialed emergency services with shaking hands. "This isn't possible," Annie whispered, but she moved forward anyway, hope and fear fighting for control of her heart. "Edward?" As Robert and Mr. Jenkins managed to pull back the damaged lid, everyone gathered around, rain forgotten, disbelief on every face. Inside lay Edward Thompson, his eyes closed, his face pale, but his chest was moving. Slightly, almost. Imperceptibly, but definitely moving. "He's breathing," Robert said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Dad's breathing." Pastor Bill placed a gentle hand on Annie's shoulder as she swayed on her feet. "I've seen many things in my years of ministry," he said quietly, "but never anything like this." In the distance, sirens wailed, coming closer. The storm moved on as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving a strange glowing light across the cemetery. No one present would ever forget what they witnessed that day. The day Edward Thompson's funeral was interrupted by a bolt of lightning. The day the impossible happened in Pine Creek, and this was just the beginning. The ambulance raced through the small streets of Pine Creek, sirens wailing as people stepped aside and watched with curious eyes. Word was already spreading through town. Something strange had happened at Edward Thompson's funeral. Something impossible. Inside the ambulance, 2 paramedics worked frantically over Edward's body. One was young, just a few years out of training. The other, Dave Wilson, had been with Pine Creek Emergency Services for over 20 years. In all that time, he'd never seen anything like this. "I've got a pulse," Dave said, his voice tight with concentration. It's weak, but steady. The younger paramedic shook his head in disbelief. How is this possible? The man was pronounced dead 3 days ago. Dave didn't answer. There was no answer that made sense. Instead, he focused on keeping Edward stable as they rushed toward Pine Creek Community Hospital. Annie and Robert followed in Mr. Jenkins' truck, speeding just behind the ambulance. Annie clutched the door handle, her knuckles white, her mind racing with questions and hope and fear all mixed together. "Mom, try to breathe," Robert said, though his own voice shook. "We don't know what's happening yet." "He was gone," Annie whispered. "I saw him. I touched his face after it happened. He was cold. How could this be real?" Mr. Jenkins kept his eyes on the road following the ambulances, flashing lights. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I saw him breathing with my own eyes. Something happened when that lightning hit." The small hospital came into view, its emergency entrance already busy with activity. Word had reached them and a team was waiting outside despite the lingering rain. Dr. Helen Chen, the hospital's most experienced physician, stood at the front of the group, her face serious and focused. As the ambulance doors flew open, Dr. Chen moved forward. "Get him into Trauma 1, she ordered, then spotted Annie climbing out of the truck. Her expression softened just slightly. "Annie, Robert, come with me. This is unusual, to say the least." Inside, the hospital buzzed with controlled chaos. Nurses rushed back and forth, equipment was wheeled in. Voices called out medical terms that Annie barely understood. Through it all, she kept her eyes on Edward's face. His skin had more color now, not the gray paleness of death she had grown accustomed to over the past 3 days, but not quite the warm tone of life either. Something in between. "I want everyone who isn't essential medical personnel to wait outside," Dr. Chen said firmly but kindly. "Annie, you and Robert can stay, but please stand back and let us work." For the next hour, they watched as the medical team ran test after test. Edward was connected to monitors that beeped steadily, tracking a heartbeat that shouldn't exist. Blood samples were rushed to the lab. A portable X-ray machine was brought in, then an ultrasound. Through it all, Edward remained unconscious but undeniably alive. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Occasionally, his fingers would twitch slightly. Dr. Chen finally stepped back, removing her stethoscope from around her neck with a puzzled expression. "I don't understand this," she admitted, turning to Annie and Robert. "Medically speaking, this shouldn't be happening. His heart is beating. His lungs are working. Brain activity is present, though not at normal waking levels." "What does that mean?" Robert asked. "Is he in a coma?" "Something like that," Dr. Chen said carefully. "But different. Look, I need to be honest with you both. I've never seen a case like this in 25 years of medicine. None of us have." Annie moved closer to Edward's bedside, gently taking his hand. It felt warm now, not like at the funeral home where she had said her final goodbye. "But he's alive?" "Yes," Dr. Chen confirmed. "By every medical definition, he's alive. What I can't tell you is how or what happens next." Outside the trauma room, the hospital waiting area had filled with people from the funeral. Pastor Bill sat quietly in a corner, his Bible open but his eyes distant as if seeking answers beyond its pages. Mr. Jenkins paced the floor, occasionally stopping to update his wife on the phone. Even the funeral director had come, looking completely bewildered by the turn of events. As word spread further, local news reporters arrived. The hospital security guard kept them outside, but their presence signaled that this story was about to go beyond the boundaries of Pine Creek. Back in the trauma room, a nurse rushed in with laboratory results. Dr. Chen studied them, her eyebrows rising higher with each page she turned. "What is it?" Robert asked, noticing her expression. "His electrolyte levels are unusual," she said carefully. "And there are other markers here that don't make sense. I'd like to consult with some colleagues." She paused, looking uncomfortable. This may be a case that interests medical researchers, the lightning strike. It seems to have had some effect we don't understand yet. Annie straightened her shoulders. My husband is not going to be a laboratory specimen, she said firmly. Whatever help he needs, we'll get it. But he's a person, not a medical curiosity. Dr. Chen nodded respectfully. Of course, I only meant that we might need specialized help to understand what's happening and how best to treat him. A soft groan from the bed drew everyone's attention. Edward's eyelids fluttered, though they didn't open. Edward? Annie leaned closer, hope rising in her chest. Edward, can you hear me? His fingers twitched again, curling slightly around hers, not a firm grip, but definitely a response. I'll get more equipment, Dr. Chen said, hurrying from the room. We need to monitor his brain activity more closely. Left alone with Edward, Annie and Robert stood in stunned silence for a moment. Dad? Robert tried, his voice cracking. If you can hear us, try to squeeze Mom's hand again. Several seconds passed. Then, slowly, Edward's fingers tightened once more around Annie's. Tears filled her eyes. He knows we're here, she whispered. Robert, he knows. The next few hours passed, in a blur. More tests were run. Specialists were called in from neighboring towns. The hospital administrator pulled Dr. Chen aside, clearly concerned about the unusual situation and the growing crowd of onlookers outside. By evening, Edward had been moved to the intensive care unit. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. Annie refused to leave his side, even when Robert brought her a sandwich and insisted she eat something. I lost him once, she said quietly. I'm not leaving this room until I know he's really back with us. Outside Edward's room, the conversation among medical staff grew more technical and more baffled. Dr. Chen had consulted with neurologists in the city, cardiac specialists, even a physicist who had studies about electrical impulses and their effects on human tissue. The current theory, she explained to Robert when he stepped outside for a moment, is that the lightning somehow acted as an incredibly powerful defibrillator. Your father had a pacemaker, correct? Robert nodded. Yes, he got it 3 years ago after some heart rhythm problems. The electrical charge may have interacted with it in some way, Dr. Chen continued. But that doesn't explain everything we're seeing. The changes in his blood work, for instance. And normally, after 3 days. She trailed off, not wanting to speak the obvious, that bodies begin to change after death in ways that can't be reversed. As night fell over Pine Creek, the hospital grew quieter. Most of the onlookers had gone home, though a few reporters remained, hoping for updates. Inside the ICU, Annie dozed in a chair beside Edward's bed, her hand still holding his. She woke suddenly when she felt movement, stronger this time. Edward's hand was definitely gripping hers now. Edward, she whispered, leaning forward in the dimly lit room. His eyelids fluttered again, and this time they opened just a sliver. Confused, unfocused eyes peered out. Annie pressed the call button frantically. He's waking up, she called out. Someone come quickly. A night nurse rushed in, took one look at Edward, and immediately paged Dr. Chen, who had refused to go home despite the late hour. Within minutes, the room filled with medical staff again. This time they watched in amazement as Edward's eyes opened wider, blinking in the sudden brightness as someone turned up the lights. What? His voice was just a dry rasp, barely audible. Don't try to talk yet, Dr. Chen said, moving forward to check his pupils with a small light. You've been through quite an ordeal, Mr. Thompson. Edward's eyes moved around the room, confusion clear in his expression. When he saw Annie, though, something changed. Recognition flickered there. Annie? He managed. The word barely formed. She nodded, tears streaming down her face now. Yes, love, I'm here. Robert's here too, he just went to get some coffee. You're in the hospital. Edward tried to speak again but couldn't form the words. His eyes asked the question instead. Why? Dr. Chen gently moved Annie aside. Mr. Thompson, do you remember what happened to you? He stared blankly at her. You had a heart attack, she explained slowly. in Mrs. Wilson's kitchen. Do you remember that? A faint flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by confusion again. That was 4 days ago. Dr. Chen continued. There's no easy way to say this, but you were clinically dead. You were being buried today when something extraordinary happened. Edward's eyes widened slightly. Lightning struck your coffin during the funeral, she said, her medical professionalism not quite hiding her own amazement at the words. And somehow, against everything we understand about medicine, you're back with us. Outside in the hallway, Robert returned with 2 cups of coffee just as Dr. Chen was explaining. He nearly dropped them both, rushing into the room when he saw his father's open eyes. "Dad," he exclaimed, "you're awake." The look of confusion on Edward's face grew. He opened his mouth again, struggling to speak. Funeral? He finally managed to whisper. Annie squeezed his hand. "Yes, love. It was your funeral. But you're back now. Somehow you've come back to us." As the reality of what she was saying sank in, Edward's monitors began to beep faster. Dr. Chen moved quickly. "He needs to stay calm," she said firmly. "This is too much information at once. Mr. Thompson, try not to worry about understanding everything right now. Focus on the fact that you're safe, your family is here, and we're taking good care of you." Gradually, the beeping slowed. Edward's eyes remained open, moving from face to face with questions he couldn't yet ask. In that moment, no one in the room fully understood what had happened or what might come next. They only knew they were witnessing something that defied explanation, something that would forever change not just Edward's life, but all of theirs. And outside, as news began to spread beyond Pine Creek to the wider world, the story of the man who came back to life after lightning struck his coffin was just beginning to unfold. By morning, the small Pine Creek community hospital was surrounded by news vans. Reporters from the nearest big cities had arrived overnight, setting up cameras and microphones, all hoping to get the first interview about what people were already calling the Pine Creek miracle. Hospital security guards stood at every entrance, turning away anyone who didn't have a medical reason to be there. Inside, in a private room that had been quickly arranged, Edward Thompson was sitting up slightly, supported by pillows. The overnight hours had brought surprising improvements. His breathing had strengthened, his heart rate had steadied, and most remarkably, his ability to speak had returned, though his voice remained raspy and weak. "It doesn't make any sense," he said to Annie, who hadn't left his side except for quick bathroom breaks. "I remember feeling a pain in my chest at Mrs. Wilson's house. I remember falling. Then nothing until I woke up here." Annie held his hand, still marveling at its warmth. "The doctors don't understand it either. They've been making calls to specialists all night." "What was it like?" Edward asked suddenly, his eyes focused intently on hers. "My funeral?" Annie hesitated, unsure if talking about it would upset him. "It was beautiful," she finally said. "Everyone from town came. Pastor Bill said lovely things about you bringing light to people's lives. I talked about how we met in the rain." Edward's mouth turned up slightly at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. "And then I got hit by lightning, that's what they're telling me." "We all saw it," Annie confirmed. "It hit your coffin directly. At first we thought it had just damaged the casket. But then the workers heard you making sounds." Edward was quiet for a long moment. "So I was really dead? For 3 days?" Before Annie could answer, Dr. Chen entered the room, accompanied by a tall woman in a crisp suit who carried a leather briefcase. Behind them came Robert, looking tired but excited. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Dr. Chen said, checking the monitors beside his bed. "You're continuing to improve at a remarkable rate." "Who's this?" Edward asked, nodding toward the woman in the suit. "I'm Dr. Patricia Winters from the University Medical Center," the woman introduced herself. "I specialize in unusual medical cases and electrical effects on human physiology. Dr. Chen asked me to consult on your case." Edward raised an eyebrow. "So I'm an unusual medical case now?" Dr. Winters smiled slightly. "Mr. Thompson, you're quite possibly unique in modern medical history. A man who was clinically dead for 3 days, then revived after a lightning strike. Yes, I'd say that's unusual. Robert moved to the other side of the bed. The internet is going crazy about you, Dad. It's all over social media. People are calling it a miracle, a sign from God, evidence of supernatural forces, you name it. Oh, boy, Edward sighed. I was hoping to avoid that kind of attention. Annie squeezed his hand. The hospital administrator asked if we wanted to make a statement just to calm things down. I said we needed time to process everything first. Good call, Edward said, then turned his attention back to the doctors. So what happens now? Dr. Chen and Dr. Winters exchanged glances. We'd like to run some additional tests, Dr. Chen explained. Your recovery is progressing faster than we expected, which is wonderful but also raises new questions. What kind of tests? Annie asked, a protective edge to her voice. Dr. Winters opened her briefcase and pulled out some papers. Non-invasive? Scans mostly. Brain activity, heart function, electrical patterns in your nervous system. With your permission, we'd also like to take blood samples at regular intervals to track certain markers we've noticed. Edward looked down at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. There's something different, he said quietly. I can't explain it, but I feel changed somehow. Everyone in the room went still, waiting for him to continue. It's not just being weak from lying in a bed, he tried to explain. It's like, have you ever touched a battery with your tongue as a kid? That little zap? I feel a bit like that. All over, all the time. Dr. Winters was taking notes rapidly. This is fascinating. Mr. Thompson, would you allow us to measure the electrical output from your skin? It's a simple test, completely painless. Edward nodded slowly. If it helps. Explain what happened to me, sure. But I don't want to become some lab rat. I want to go home eventually, back to normal life. That's our goal too, Dr. Chen assured him, to get you healthy enough to return home. As the doctors left to arrange the tests, Robert pulled a chair closer to the bed. I called your friend Tom. He's keeping the workshop closed for now, but he says whenever you're ready, it's waiting for you. Edward smiled weakly. Good old Tom, always dependable. He paused, his expression growing more serious. How are you two really doing with all this? It must be, well, I can't even imagine what it must be like. Annie and Robert exchanged glances. It's been a roller coaster, Robert admitted. 3 days ago, we were planning your funeral. Yesterday, we were at your funeral. Now we're sitting here talking to you. It doesn't seem real sometimes. But we're so grateful, Annie added quickly, tears forming in her eyes again. Whatever happened, however impossible it seems, you're here with us again. That's all that matters. Throughout the day, Edward underwent a series of tests. Technicians wheeled in equipment, asked him questions, took measurements, and whispered to each other in surprised tones. Through it all, Edward remained calm, though Annie could tell he was growing tired of being the center of so much attention. Late in the afternoon, when they finally had a moment alone, Edward turned to Annie with a troubled expression. Do you believe in second chances? He asked suddenly. Annie thought for a moment. I always have, she said. Why do you ask? Because that's what this is, isn't it? A second chance. And I keep wondering why me? Why did lightning hit my coffin? And not someone else's? Why am I here talking to you when I should be? He trailed off, unable to say the words. Annie moved from her chair to sit carefully on the edge of his bed. I don't know why, love. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe it's just one of those strange things that happen sometimes. But I do know that you always made the most of every opportunity you had. I'm sure you'll do the same with this one. Outside the hospital room, the hallway had grown busier. More specialists had arrived throughout the day, eager to observe the miracle case for themselves. Hospital staff moved efficiently around them, trying to maintain normal operations despite the unusual circumstances. In the waiting area, a small group of Pine Creek residents had gathered, holding a quiet vigil for their neighbor who had died and returned. Pastor Bill sat among them, leading occasional prayers but mostly just offering silent support. As evening approached, Dr. Chen and Dr. Winters returned with results from the day's tests. Both women looked puzzled but excited. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Winters began. Your test results are showing some very unusual patterns. Your nervous system seems to be carrying electrical impulses at a higher amplitude than normal, yet your tissues aren't showing any signs of damage from this increased activity. What does that mean in plain English? Edward asked. It means, Dr. Chen explained, that your body is somehow channeling more electrical energy than a typical human body. But instead of harming you, it seems to be, well, energizing you. That's why you're recovering so quickly, Dr. Winters added. Your cells are regenerating at an accelerated rate. We took tissue samples from your arm this morning that show healing patterns we'd typically see after several weeks of recovery. Not several, hours. Edward looked at his arm where a small bandage covered the biopsy site. So the lightning didn't just restart my heart? It changed me somehow? The doctors exchanged glances again. It appears so, Dr. Winters confirmed. We've theorized that intense electrical events could alter human physiology, but we've never had a case study like yours before. Great, Edward said with a weak attempt at humor. I'm a case study now. Robert, who had been quiet during this explanation, suddenly spoke up. Could these changes be dangerous to Dad or to others? It was the question everyone had been thinking, but no one had wanted to ask. We don't believe so, Dr. Chen said carefully. All your vital signs are strong, Mr. Thompson. Your brain function is normal. The electrical differences we're measuring don't seem to extend beyond your own body. However, Dr. Winters added, we would like to continue monitoring you at least for the next few weeks. This is uncharted territory for medical science. Edward nodded slowly. I understand. But I still want to go home soon. Being in this hospital bed with all these machines beeping, it reminds me too much of my father's last days. No offense to your fine establishment, Dr. Chen, she smiled. None taken. If you continue improving at this rate, we might be able to discuss discharge in a few days, with arrangements for home monitoring and regular checkups. After the doctors left again, Edward, Annie, and Robert sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, the sky was growing dark, and the lights of news vans could be seen through the window blinds. I wonder how long they'll stick around, Robert mused, nodding toward the media presence. Until some other strange thing happens somewhere else, Edward replied. People are always looking for miracles. Isn't that what this is? Annie asked quietly. A miracle? Edward reached for her hand. I don't know what to call it. All I know is I'm grateful for whatever time I have now, whether it's a miracle or science or something in between. As night fell over Pine Creek, the Thompson family remained together in the small hospital room, talking quietly about everyday things, Robert's work, Annie's garden plans for spring, whether the old maple tree in their yard would need trimming this year. Normal conversations that felt anything but normal under the circumstances. What none of them realized yet was that Edward's return from death was just the beginning of the changes the lightning had brought. In the small town of Pine Creek, word was already spreading about the strange things happening at the hospital. Lights flickering when Edward became emotional, medical equipment behaving oddly in his presence, and most curiously, patients in nearby rooms reporting that their own recovery seemed to be accelerating. The lightning hadn't just restarted Edward's heart. It had transformed him in ways that were only beginning to become apparent. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, with Annie keeping watch beside him, small blue sparks danced briefly between his fingertips, unnoticed by everyone in the room. The Pine Creek miracle was about to become even more miraculous. A week passed at Pine Creek Community Hospital. The crowd of reporters outside had thinned somewhat, though a few persistent journalists remained, hoping for updates or the chance to be the first to interview Edward Thompson, the man who had returned from death. Inside, on the third floor, Edward was sitting in a chair by the window of his room, watching the small town go about its business despite the extraordinary events unfolding in their midst. Ready to try walking again? Asked Pete, the physical therapist who had been working with Edward for the past few days. A burly man with gentle hands, Pete had seen all kinds of recovery cases in his career. but never one quite like this. Edward nodded, rising from the chair with surprising steadiness. His strength had been returning much faster than anyone expected. Dr. Chen and Dr. Winters called it remarkable and unprecedented in their notes, but to Edward, it simply felt right, as if his body was eager to make up for lost time. "You're doing amazing," Pete commented as Edward walked the length of the room and back without assistance. "Most patients who've been bedridden would still need support." "I feel stronger every day," Edward replied. "Almost back to normal, except for..." He trailed off, not sure how to explain the other changes he was experiencing. The constant tingling sensation throughout his body, the way light bulbs sometimes flickered when he entered a room, the strange dreams of energy flowing like rivers of light. Pete checked something off on his clipboard. "Dr. Chen says you might be able to go home in a couple of days if you keep improving like this. Your family will be thrilled." Edward smiled at the thought. Annie had finally been convinced to go home and sleep in their own bed last night. After spending 6 nights in the uncomfortable hospital chair, Robert had returned to work, though he called or visited several times a day. The idea of going home, of returning to some version of normal life, was both exciting and daunting. After Pete left, Edward sat back in the chair feeling suddenly tired. These waves of exhaustion still hit him occasionally, though they passed quickly. As he rested, he absently rubbed his fingers together, something he'd been doing more frequently lately. A tiny spark jumped between his thumb and forefinger, visible for just a split second. Edward stared at his hand. This wasn't the first time he'd noticed the sparks, but they seemed to be getting stronger. He tried again, deliberately this time, focusing his attention on his fingertips. Another spark appeared, blue-white and definitely real. A knock at the door interrupted his experiment. Dr. Winters entered carrying a tablet computer and looking excited. "Mr. Thompson, how are you feeling today?" she asked, though her attention was already on the tablet, pulling up charts and readings. "Better," Edward said simply. Then after a moment's hesitation, he added, "There's something I think you should know." Dr. Winters looked up, immediately attentive. Edward held up his hand. "Watch this," he said, then concentrated again. This time, a larger spark danced between his fingers, crackling audibly in the quiet room. Dr. Winters' eyes widened. "How long has this been happening?" "I noticed small sparks a few days ago," Edward admitted. "They're getting stronger, and it's not just when I'm trying. Sometimes when I touch metal objects, there's a discharge. The nurse who brought my breakfast tray jumped back this morning when our hands touched." Dr. Winters set down her tablet and pulled a small device from her lab coat pocket. "May I measure that?" "It's an electrical field detector. We use it to check for equipment malfunctions." Edward nodded, and she held the device near his hand. Immediately, it emitted a series of rapid beeps. "Fascinating," she murmured. "Your body appears to be generating a significant electrical field. Not dangerous levels, but definitely abnormal." She looked at him with undisguised scientific curiosity. "Are there other manifestations you've noticed?" Edward hesitated again, then decided honesty was the best approach. "The lights react. To me sometimes, especially when I'm feeling strong emotions. And I'm not sure, but I think I might be affecting the medical equipment in nearby rooms. I overheard the nurses talking about how patients on this floor are recovering faster than expected." Dr. Winters was typing notes rapidly into her tablet. "This could explain the anomalous readings we've been getting. Mr. Thompson, with your permission, I'd like to run some specialized tests this afternoon. Nothing invasive, but more targeted toward understanding these electrical phenomena." "Will it delay me going home?" Edward asked. "Not necessarily. Some of the monitoring equipment could be set up at your house." She paused, studying his face. "You don't seem as surprised by this as I would expect." Edward smiled faintly. "Doctor, I was dead for 3 days and came back after being hit by lightning. At this point, shooting sparks from my fingers seems almost reasonable by comparison." Later that afternoon, Edward sat in a specialized room in the hospital basement, surrounded by equipment that measured various types of energy and electrical output. Dr. Winters and a team of technicians watched from behind a glass partition, as Edward went through a series of simple exercises designed to stimulate his newfound abilities. "Try focusing on the light bulb again," Dr. Winters instructed through an intercom. Edward concentrated on a bare light bulb set up on a table in front of him. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the bulb began to glow faintly, even though it wasn't connected to any power source. Behind the glass, the technicians murmured in amazement. Dr. Winters kept her professional composure, but her eyes showed her excitement. "Remarkable," she said. "You're actually transferring electrical energy from your body to the bulb. Can you make it brighter?" Edward focused harder, and the bulb's glow intensified. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead from the effort. After about 20 seconds, he exhaled heavily and the light faded. "That's tiring," he admitted. "I imagine so," Dr. Winters replied. "You're expending energy in a way the human body isn't designed to do. Let's take a break." As the testing continued throughout the afternoon, Edward demonstrated other surprising abilities. He could temporarily interfere with electronic equipment, sense electrical currents running through walls, and even redirect small amounts of electricity from one object to another. "It's like I can feel the energy around me," he tried to explain. "Like it's a river I can dip my hands into." By the time Annie arrived for evening visiting hours, Edward was exhausted but exhilarated. The tests had confirmed what he'd been sensing. The lightning hadn't just restarted his heart. It had fundamentally changed his relationship with electricity. "You look tired," Annie said as she entered his room, carrying a bag of home-cooked food. "Did they work you too hard in physical therapy?" Edward patted the edge of the bed, inviting her to sit. "Annie, there's something I need to show you. Promise you won't freak out?" Annie's expression turned wary. "What is it? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Just watch." He held up his hand and concentrated. A blue spark danced across his palm, then formed a tiny arc of electricity between his fingers, glowing like a miniature lightning bolt. Annie gasped, instinctively pulling back. "Edward, what? How?" "The doctors think the lightning changed something in me," he explained gently. "I've been noticing it for days, but it's getting stronger." Dr. Winters ran tests all afternoon. "Is it dangerous?" Annie asked, her voice small. Edward shook his head. "Not to me, and not to you either." He cautiously reached for her hand. "See? I can control it." Their fingers touched without any spark or shock. Annie looked at their joined hands, then back at Edward's face. "So you're what, some kind of electric man now?" Despite the seriousness of the situation, Edward chuckled. "I guess so. The doctors have lots of scientific terms for it, but basically, yes. I can generate and manipulate electrical energy. Not a lot, and it tires me out, but it's real." "And they're letting you come home knowing this?" Annie asked, concern evident in her voice. "Dr. Winters wants to set up some monitoring equipment at the house," Edward explained, "and I'll need to come back for regular checkups, but they can't keep me here forever, especially since I'm not sick. Just different." Annie was quiet for a long moment, processing this latest development in what had already been a week of impossible things. "What does this mean for our lives, Edward? For your work? What will people think?" Edward squeezed her hand. "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out together, like we always have." The next morning, a small conference was held in Edward's room. Dr. Chen and Dr. Winters were there, along with the hospital administrator and a representative from a major research university who had flown in overnight after hearing about the case. "We believe it's in everyone's best interest if we approach this situation with discretion," the administrator was saying. "The media attention is already problematic, and if word gets out about Mr. Thompson's unique abilities, it could become unmanageable." "I agree," Edward said firmly. "I don't want to become some kind of sideshow attraction." I just want to go home and figure out what normal looks like for me now. Dr. Winters nodded, though she looked slightly disappointed at the lost research opportunity. We'll continue monitoring your condition through outpatient appointments, and I'd like to set up some equipment at your home as discussed. What about the other patients? Edward asked suddenly. The ones who seem to be recovering faster when I'm around? Dr. Chen looked surprised. You've noticed that effect? The nurses talk, Edward said with a small smile. And I can feel something happening sometimes, like I'm sharing energy, I guess. The research university representative leaned forward, eagerly. This could represent a breakthrough in bioelectrical therapy. If Mr. Thompson's condition could somehow be studied, even replicated. I'm not a condition, Edward interrupted firmly. I'm a person who's been through something extraordinary and is still figuring it out. I'm willing to help with research, but on my terms and in my own time. The room fell silent for a moment. Of course, the administrator finally said. We'll respect your privacy and your wishes, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Chen will coordinate your discharge for tomorrow morning, and Dr. Winters will arrange the home monitoring equipment. As the meeting broke up, Annie, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, moved to Edward's side. You handled that well, she whispered. I had to, he replied. Otherwise, they'd keep me in labs forever. He looked around the hospital room that had been his home for the past week. I'm ready to leave this place, ready to see what this new life has in store. What neither Edward nor the doctors yet understood was that his abilities were still evolving, growing stronger each day. The full impact of what had happened when lightning struck his coffin was still unfolding, with consequences that would soon extend far beyond the small town of Pine Creek. As the sun set outside his window, Edward practiced making small arcs of electricity dance between his fingers, each one brighter than the last. Something new was awakening in him, something powerful, something that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky as if in answer. 6 months had passed since the day lightning struck Edward Thompson's coffin. Spring had turned to summer, and now the first hints of fall colored the trees around Pine Creek. Life in the small town had gradually returned to a version of normal, though nothing would ever be quite the same again. Edward stood in his workshop, behind the house, carefully installing a new light fixture for Mrs. Wilson, the same woman whose kitchen he'd been working in when his heart had stopped all those months ago. His hands moved with practiced skill, connecting wires and securing brackets. He didn't need tools to test if the circuit was live anymore. He could feel the electricity flowing like water through a pipe. Are you sure this is safe? Mrs. Wilson asked, watching nervously from the doorway. Everyone in town knew about Edward's abilities by now, though most had never seen them demonstrated. Perfectly safe, Edward assured her with a warm smile. I'm being extra careful with your fixtures. In truth, his control had improved dramatically over the months. What had started as unpredictable sparks and surges had developed into precise, deliberate manipulation of electrical energy. He could now power small devices without batteries, detect wiring problems through walls, and even help jumpstart cars with just a touch, a skill that had made him particularly popular among teenagers with old vehicles. After finishing the installation, Edward packed his tools and drove home in his truck, waving to neighbors along the way. Some still looked at him with wonder or unease, but most had adjusted to having their local electrician back from the dead, with some unusual new talents. At home, Annie was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of pot roast, Edward's favorite, filled the air. She smiled when he entered, looking more relaxed than she had in the early days after his return. How was Mrs. Wilson's light fixture? She asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. All fixed, Edward replied, washing his hands at the sink, though she still watches me like I might explode into a ball of lightning at any moment. Annie laughed, softly. Give people time. It's not every day someone comes back from the dead with superpowers. Edward made a face at the word. They're not superpowers, just electrical sensitivity. Says the man who charged my phone this morning by holding it, Annie teased, handing him plates to set the table. Their easy banter was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, they could see Dr. Winters, stepping out carrying her now familiar medical bag filled with specialized equipment. Right on time, Edward said. Weekly checkup day. Dr. Winters had continued monitoring Edward's condition, though her visits had decreased from daily to weekly as his abilities stabilized. The university lab equipment that had initially cluttered one room of their house had been gradually removed as Edward's readings became more consistent. Good evening, Dr. Winters greeted them as Annie let her in. Though still professionally focused, the doctor had become something of a friend over the months. How are we feeling this week, Mr. Thompson? Edward sat at the kitchen table, rolling up his sleeve for the usual tests. Same as last week. Good energy levels, no unexpected discharges, and I managed to power Robert's entire house during that 3-hour outage on Tuesday without getting too tired. Dr. Winters raised her eyebrows as she attached sensors to his arm. The whole house? That's new. It just felt easier somehow, Edward explained. Like my capacity is increasing. Annie placed a cup of coffee beside the doctor. Is that something we should be concerned about? Dr. Winters studied the readings on her portable device. Not necessarily. Your husband's condition has been steadily evolving since the beginning. His body seems to be adapting to its new capabilities. She looked up at Edward. Have you been practicing the focusing exercises we discussed? Edward nodded. Every morning and evening, I can direct the energy much more precisely now. The checkup continued with the usual measurements and questions. Toward the end, Dr. Winters brought up a new topic. The research team at the university has been analyzing all our data, she said carefully. They've developed a theory about what happened to you, Mr. Thompson. Would you like to hear it? Edward and Annie exchanged glances. Of course, Edward, replied. Dr. Winters set down her equipment. We believe the lightning strike created what we're calling a bioelectrical recalibration. Your heart had stopped, but your brain still had minimal activity, undetectable by standard methods but present nonetheless. When the lightning hit your pacemaker, it didn't just restart your heart like a defibrillator. It created a new pathway for electrical energy throughout your entire system. So I'm rewired? Edward asked. In a manner of speaking, yes, Dr. Winters confirmed. Your nervous system now functions as both a conductor and generator of electrical energy, something we've never seen before in medical literature. Annie frowned slightly. Will this shorten his life? All this extra energy running through him? Dr. Winters smiled reassuringly. Actually, all indications point to the opposite effect. Your cellular regeneration is approximately 30% faster than average, Mr. Thompson. Your tissue samples show remarkable resilience to damage. If this trend continues, you could potentially have increased longevity. Edward took a moment to absorb this information. So I died, came back, and now might live longer than normal? That's a lot to wrap my head around. It's a lot for medical science to wrap its head around, too, Dr. Winters admitted. Which brings me to the other reason for my visit today. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. The university is proposing a formal research partnership. Full transparency, ethical guidelines, fair compensation, and most importantly, you would maintain complete control over how your abilities are studied and used. Edward took the folder but didn't open it. I'll think about it, he said. But my priority is still getting back to normal life as much as possible. After Dr. Winters left, Edward and Annie sat on their back porch, watching fireflies blink in the early evening darkness. Robert would be coming for dinner soon with his girlfriend, completing their small family circle. What are you thinking about? Annie asked, noticing Edward's contemplative expression. He was quiet for a moment. I've been visiting the hospital, he finally said. Not just for checkups, I've been going to the cancer ward. Annie turned to face him. You have? Since when? About 2 months now, Edward admitted. It started when I ran into Bill Peterson's wife at the grocery store. She told me his cancer had spread, that the doctors had given him weeks to live. I went to see him just to talk, But when I shook his hand, I felt something, like energy transferring from me to him. Annie's eyes widened. What happened? His nurse called the next day. Said his blood work showed improvement for the first time in months. Edward looked down at his hands. So I went back, and then I started visiting other patients. Nothing dramatic, just sitting with them, holding their hands, concentrating on sharing whatever this energy is that I have now. Edward, Annie whispered, are you healing people? Not healing exactly, he clarified quickly. More like giving their bodies a boost to heal themselves. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it makes a difference. He looked at her uncertainly. I didn't tell you because it sounded crazy even after everything we've been through. Annie reached for his hand. It doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like you've been given a gift, and you're using it to help others, just like you always have, even before the lightning. Edward squeezed her hand gently. Dr. Chen has noticed the pattern. She's been tracking recovery rates. That's part of what the research proposal is about, studying this effect more formally. And what do you want to do? Annie asked. Edward looked out at the fireflies again. I think I want to understand it better. Not to become famous or to make money, but to help more effectively. If what happened to me can somehow benefit others, then maybe there was a purpose to all this. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell completely. From inside the house, the lights glowed warmly, powered in part by the man who had once been dead but now lived with extraordinary energy flowing through him. In the distance, a summer storm was building, lightning occasionally illuminating the clouds. Edward watched it without fear. He understood now that the lightning hadn't been a random accident or a miracle without purpose. It had been a transformation, a second beginning. The sound of Robert's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Life was calling, dinner with family, laughter around the table, plans for tomorrow's work. Normal things that felt precious. After having been lost and found again, Edward stood and helped Annie to her feet. Whatever happens next, he said, we'll face it together. As they walked back into the house, the lights brightened slightly in response to Edward's presence, a small reminder of how much had changed and how much remained the same. The man whose coffin had been struck by lightning had become something new, something never seen before. Not quite a miracle, not quite science, but somewhere in between. And in the small town of Pine Creek, the story of Edward Thompson, the man who died, returned, and learned to share his remarkable gift with others, was just beginning its next chapter. In the end, the most shocking thing wasn't that lightning had struck a coffin during a funeral. The most shocking thing was how one man chose to use the extraordinary second chance he'd been given, not for fame or fortune, but to bring a different kind of light into the world, one person at a time.